Elon Musk came out and explained how important it is to know your data, especially with tech companies like Apple. It's important not to allow them to use their power in bad faith against their customers in the market. According to Musk, Apple does not care about fairness, about who it will hurt. All it cares about is money. And turns out Musk was right about many things he said, because Apple is in trouble. So Apple has been sued for manipulating its influence against millions of Spotify users and their friends, and with that, very unfairly destroying competition. And as Musk said, the crying woman influencer in the tweet, who's an Apple customer, was the perfect example of why he's right about Apple. As a result, the company paid a historic, record-breaking fine, around $2 billion, that was imposed by the European Commission. However, this was just a tip of the iceberg because the things that were revealed about what Apple has done are insane, and things might get so bad that it might completely collapse Apple. So let's explain everything. First of all, it's important to mention that this lawsuit is one of the biggest and problematic ones in Apple's history, and it started a few years ago. Even today, no one really knows how bad this will end for the company. So it started in 2019 when Spotify's CEO, Daniel Ek, publicly slammed Apple over how the App Store operates. Ek said Apple was abusing its power, blocking music streaming apps from even talking to users about cheaper options, and forcing them to use Apple's in-app payments with that infamous 30% cut. That pressure from Spotify led the European Commission to open a formal antitrust investigation in 2020, focusing on whether Apple was deliberately using its dominance in the iOS ecosystem to lock out competition and keep users from hearing about better deals outside the App Store. That's when the whole thing exploded. Apple got dragged into various scandals, and the world suddenly realized how broken their system really was. That's why Apple was later hit with serious accusations, not just about some mild violations, but breaking actual EU competition law. By 2021, the EU narrowed its investigation to one key issue: how Apple treated music streaming apps specifically. The spotlight was on Apple's anti-steering rules, which banned developers from telling users where to subscribe for less. Apple basically locked developers into its system while conveniently giving Apple Music a free pass. So Spotify and other competitors had to play by strict rules, while Apple's own service could do whatever it wanted. And here's the worst part: Apple knew what it was doing intentionally. That imbalance was a huge red flag for EU regulators, who saw it as Apple protecting its turf at the expense of fair competition. This was the turning point, and Apple's biggest mistake. Instead of creating an open and fair marketplace, Apple set up a system it fully controlled. The App Store guidelines kept changing, no one could negotiate, and developers were left walking on eggshells. If they pushed back, their app could be rejected or pulled. The EU saw this as Apple abusing its gatekeeper position, intentionally limiting choices, raising prices, and crushing competitors to protect its own services from real competition. Then came the hammer. In March 2024, the situation got worse. Apple's legal team and the representatives of the Commission met again. They argued that this was fair, it didn't help Apple users, and dragging it out even more would just delay the process. And in spite of the fact that a lot of users were asking for it, CEO Tim Cook didn't apologize for these wrongdoings. And as a result, in March, the European Commission hit Apple with a record-breaking fine, 1.84 billion euros. The charge? Anti-steering in music apps. Regulators said Apple had used its market dominance for years to twist competition in its favor. And it's interesting to point out that these lines up exactly what Elon Musk was saying about Apple for years. Elon famously didn't hold back while talking about Tesla's tech when he made it clear they're not building a walled garden, like an Apple. Musk said, "It is our goal to support the advent of sustainable energy. It is not to create a walled garden and use that to bludgeon our competitors, which is sometimes used by some companies." Then Musk did a fake cough and said, "Apple." Right after that, he jumped into the Epic versus Apple fight over App Store rules. Musk tweeted, "Apple App Store fees are a de facto global tax on the internet," then backed Epic directly. Epic is right. Once again, Musk positioned himself as a guy pushing back against big tech's control. Apple appealed immediately, taking the case to the General Court in Luxembourg, but they still had to pay the fine. It was a massive blow, both financially and symbolically. The EU had just proved it was willing to go after the biggest tech giants with serious consequences. But this wasn't just about the money. It was a warning shot. The EU was sending a loud message. If you're a dominant digital platform and you block competition, manipulate the market, or stifle innovation, you will be held accountable. The fine wasn't random either. It was designed to hurt. It exceeded more than a week's worth of Apple's profits, and it made it clear that Europe wasn't going to tolerate abuse from tech giants anymore. Apple's problems didn't end there. With the Digital Markets Act, DMA, coming into force in 2023, new rules targeted gatekeepers like Apple. And in April 2025, the EU hit them again, this time with a 500 million euros fine, again over anti-steering. This was the first fine under the DMA. Regulators said Apple still wasn't playing fair. Developers were still struggling to guide users to outside payment options even after warnings. Apple was told to change and didn't. So Apple responded by announcing new App Store rules in late June 2025. They said developers could now link to external payments and even offered a new commission structure, 5% for outside payments, up to 13% if they use Apple's system. But critics didn't buy it. Epic Games CEO Tim Sweeney called it malicious compliance, accusing Apple of swapping one control mechanism for another. The EU didn't back off. They began reviewing the new policies to see if Apple was actually following the DMA or just pretending to. Right now, both major fines, 1.84 billion euros under antitrust and 500 million euros under the DMA, are under appeal. These court battles could drag on for years. But in the meantime, the EU is still monitoring Apple's every move. If Apple keeps breaking the rules, it could face daily fines of up to 5% of its global revenue, roughly 50 million euros per day. That's not just pressure. That's an existential threat to the way Apple runs its platform. And looking forward, things could get ugly fast, real ugly. Apple might be forced to make much deeper changes in how the App Store operates, especially in Europe. If regulators find that Apple is still using shady tactics, they could order sideloading or full third-party App Store access. That would destroy Apple's walled garden. It would change the structure of their mobile business forever and weaken their tight control over iOS. Now here's where it gets worse. If the current process gets delayed, don't expect this to be over quickly. Both sides will likely push the fight over the edge. The nightmare scenario for Apple? Billions more in fines and enforced structural changes that cut out the most profitable parts of the App Store. And once Europe opens that door, other countries might walk right through it. US regulators, Japan, South Korea, they could all follow the EU's lead. If Apple loses control of how apps and payments work on their platform, it won't just hurt in Europe. It could break their entire services model worldwide. That's a ripple effect Apple is desperately trying to avoid. Consequences might be so bad that it might completely collapse Apple. Considering what happened with the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018 and this ongoing privacy policy lawsuit with Meta and how it affected the company, these are very unexpected problems that tech giants are facing. And the funny part? For both companies, Musk called it a few years ago. And now it seems like Musk may have been right on the money with his assumptions about Facebook and Apple. And so many people agree with Musk, judging by statements from famous people about Facebook and Apple. And that's it for today.